Good evening, comrades. Welcome back to our next, I think it must be the fourth or fifth education series we've put on as the Labour Left Alliance. Very much looking forward to this one, as all the other ones. Very timely, obviously. Witch hunts against the left, nothing new. It's going to be a worthwhile discussion. Has the witch hunt against the left in the last 6 years, has it been precedented or unprecedented? I thought it was. The thousands of people who have been suspended and expelled in the last 6 years must be a record, but I'm told maybe it's not. And maybe it was quite as bad in previous decades. I'm gagging to find out. So without further ado, thank you very much to Kevin, who's very much put this series together and organized a few speakers. I should say there are a couple of sessions where comrades could put themselves forward to present a session if they so want, especially if women or any members of any Black members or supporters would like to put themselves forward. Ethnic minorities would be much appreciated. At the moment, it's very much, you know, men at a certain age, of a certain age. It's a reflection of reality, but of course, if we could have some more women, etc., who are experts on these matters, that'd be great to hear from them. Thank you very much, Kevin. Fire away.
Okay, thanks, Tina. I'll re-identify myself as 25 if that helps. Okay, well, good evening, comrades. The nights are starting to draw in, so that must mean another LLA education series. And this series is about the nature of the left in the Labour Party, but also the witch hunts against the left and the ways that that's been fought. And it looks really at this topic over the course of about 140 years or so. Tonight's session actually looks in many ways at the left before there really was a Labour Party as we understand it. The Labour Party as an individual member organisation only really came into existence in 1918. And along with Clause 4, which gave it a bit more ideological coherence than it had had before, in many ways, 1918 could be considered the start date of the Labour Party, certainly in organisational form. So in a sense, I'm perhaps preempting that, but I'm talking about the nature of the left. And in fact, that left was going to have its sort of historical importance, and it was going to affect not only the Labour Party, but also the Communist Party, which is formed in 1920. So we're really looking at something of the precursors to that movement. Before I begin, I'd like to just share the screen with you and point towards, if I can, some reading. There are really quite a lot of books on the history of this period, and I've really just suggested a few of them. That's not to say that I think they're all brilliant and that they are the last word, because they're not, but I think they are quite helpful. And they would be, I think, available in many academic libraries, and you could also order them through public libraries, I'm sure. A couple of them may also be available online and so on. The History of the Social Democratic Federation by Martin Crick, not Michael Crick, the journalist, is although it's now nearly 30 years old, it's probably one of the more up-to-date accounts of the SDF, which is an important organization. And likewise, quite an elderly book now, Kendall's The Revolutionary Movement in Britain, has also got some relevant material in it. In those books, there are also bibliographies, countless, both primary sources and secondary accounts. And I'm sure that comrades, if they do a search, will find many others. My own interests have been in this period, and I have done some original research into the ILP and the SDF in parts of Lancashire and West Yorkshire. To that extent, I will bring some of that into the talk this evening. But as ever, if comrades are interested, they can pursue a lot of these topics, both online and also in local record offices, particularly in those parts of the country where these organizations were quite important. And indeed, I first got an idea of the nature of some of these organizations by talking to older members of the Labour Party who, as children, had known some of the veterans who'd been in these groups. These are people that I met in the 1980s who were then in their 70s and 80s, who attended things like the Clarion cycling clubs or the Socialist Sunday schools. And indeed, when I went round to talk to somebody, he started rummaging through one of his drawers. There were all these socks and clothes came out of it. And then he pulled out this bit of paper which had been used to line the drawer, which is a habit that people had. And it was some old copies of the Social Democratic Federation paper Justice, which dated from about 1902, 1903. So you sometimes turn up all sorts of material like this. And you know, I hope that if you are interested, you'll go ahead and do some of your own work. Anyway, the main interest this evening is not really an antiquarian, sort of purely historical one. It's to try and learn something more about the left and its impact on British politics. And I'm going to specify the left. I did a previous series when I talked about the Labour Party, and of course, we need to fit the Labour Party into this. But I'm going to talk primarily about the left groupings. And there are a number of themes. I won't be able to cover them, but these are some of the themes, I think, of the politics of that period, particularly really quite key issues of strategy and tactics. Did the left stand for reform, particularly reform, perhaps immediate reform, immediate demands, or did it stand for revolution? And if it stood for one or the other, what was the relationship of, say, reform to revolution? So that when, for example, socialists began to be elected onto school boards or boards of guardians or local authorities, what did they do? What did they do with it? Did they just use it as a platform to propagandize? Or did they start, for example, attempting to increase the wages of council employees or provide free meals for poor children or improve healthcare in the workhouses? So these were often quite important practical questions, and how that then fitted into the broader strategy for developing socialism became important questions of strategy and tactics. An important question which is often sort of begged by this period is how important was Marxism, and particularly the nature of the Marxism that these groups upheld. Again, if you read the material, you do find plenty of references to Marx. You find serializations of some of Marx's sort of introductory pamphlets. Justice, which was the Social Democratic Federation's newspaper, serialized the Communist Manifesto. It also carried some of Marx's basic sort of economic pamphlets, and indeed even carried quite large selections from Capital. But we know from certainly the reading that was the materials that were sold by groups like the SDF, that the type of Marxist classics, which are now pretty widely available, were then not really known to members of these groups. And many of the, I suppose, many of the more theoretical works and many of the works which sort of inform Marxism, particularly the more philosophical works, were not known in English often until well after the First World War, and in some cases not even until the 1960s. So the Marxism of these groups, I think, is interesting. They clearly do see themselves as Marxists, but there are other elements in there as well. Particularly in the case of the SDF, quite a lot of emphasis on what we might think of as homegrown socialism, Robert Owen, but also sort of the radical democratic ideas of groups like the Chartists or the parliamentary reformers and radicals of the 18th century and before. So looking at the nature of their ideas, I think is quite useful. And also this key sort of dividing idea about, quote, the class war. And this again is a way in which the SDF distinguish themselves from other groups, particularly from groups like the ILP, who, although many of their activists might well use the language of class war, tended also to put forward ideas in terms of ethical socialism, maybe even a type of moral improvement, again, drawing on another strand which Marx had made a criticism of in the Communist Manifesto of these sort of semi-religious ideas. Also, an interesting issue was the relationship of these left groups to the debates in the Second International, particularly the debates in the German socialist movement on strategy, program, revolutionary consciousness. Again, the reports in the papers carry information about this. And indeed, we know from the minutes of those meetings that British delegates did attend and did put forward arguments. And we can read the reports. So it's very clear that the discussions that are taking place outside of taking outside of Britain do have some impact. And so we shouldn't just simply see these groups as sort of inward looking, cut off, and indeed perhaps out of touch with the wider theory. Other issues are the relationship of these parties to existing parties, particularly the Tories and the Liberals. Many of the early socialists developed from the radical wing of the Liberal Party, and still in many cases, as indeed was more generally true of the Labour Party, would regard the Liberals as the lesser of two evils. And indeed, in some instances, members of the Labour Party would argue for a progressive alliance in which they would have an electoral pact or other sorts of arrangements with the Liberal Party. So how would this, for example, affect electoral strategy? Would the aim be to knock out one of the bourgeois parties, the Liberals as in particular, or would you have a position of regarding both as equally a target, or indeed would you enter into some sort of progressive alliance to destroy the Liberals? That might even mean voting for the Tories. So there were debates of this character. The other key themes are ones which have, I think, a lot of contemporary resonance when people are talking about their relationship to the Labour Party and indeed to the wider Labour movement. And that, of course, is on the issue of elections. What was the importance of elections? Could socialism come through Parliament? Could it be achieved incrementally? Could it be achieved peacefully, or would it involve the use of violence? What was the importance of Parliament as a way to mobilise, and indeed of parliamentary politics, standing candidates and using it as a platform? Many of the groups were relatively successful in gaining, modest but not insignificant shares of votes, 20 and 30% in some constituencies into the 20s, and this again, I think, throws up some interesting questions for us today. But probably the question that did lead to a lot of division is on the issue of trade unions and that movement that develops in the years before the First World War, militant trade unionism, revolutionary trade unionism, or syndicalism, a movement which tends to downplay the political and certainly the electoral, and in particular would argue in some cases that political parties, particularly a party like the Labour Party, had failed to represent workers' interests, and that the real struggle, as it were, was at the point of production. And the industrial movements, really dating from the late 1880s, but going on well before the First World War as well, gave an impetus to that sort of politics. The Socialist Labour Party, which was a split from the Social Democratic Federation, and later was to have some influence in the Communist Party, they in particular put a lot of emphasis on industrial trade unionism, and indeed the role of trade union militancy and that type of action as a way of building up revolutionary consciousness. But of course, the big debate was the relationship to the Labour Party, and indeed whether socialists should have any connections with the Labour Party. And I suppose this began to polarize around two broad themes. One was the idea of socialist unity, in which the people who were explicitly socialist and committed to socialism, as opposed to merely Labour representation, should join together in one group, or whether they should cooperate with the broader front, particularly the trade unions, and other progressive elements in what became known as the Labour Alliance. Essentially, I suppose the way of defining that argument, particularly as it starts to emerge just before the First World War, is that the Labour Party's broad alliance, and particularly the role of the trade unions, who simply see at this stage the Labour Party as a way of securing immediate concessions for the unions, overturning legal judgments that have hampered the power of the trade unions, or advancing working class interests as securing reforms, but in many ways hanging on the coattail of the Liberals. That sort of Labour alliance was clearly, it was suggested, not going to take the movement forward. It would do no more than serve up forms of reformism. And so the argument of socialist unity, of all socialists coming together and working as a coherent socialist, explicitly socialist party, and particularly political action to secure political power. Socialist unity didn't preclude some orientation towards the Labour Party, indeed even affiliation, but the emphasis was clearly on the need to develop a distinct socialist voice in that way. And of course, the big questions that are going to come up at the end of our period, and really in some ways start to mark the real division in the Labour movement, are of course the imperialist war, defining it as an imperialist war, even if that sometimes goes into a more pacifistic anti-war direction, rather comparable to elements of the Zimmerwald grouping. But that would be in distinction to the defensists or the right, or the social imperialists, as Lenin was to call them, who support the British, or their government, as they would refer to it, in the imperialist war. And of course, that's going to lead to divisions, and indeed there's a very clear distinction between sections of the Labour Party, sections of the left, who take very different positions. And then of course the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, is, I think, the sort of defining line, and that really clarifies many of these issues which have been in the international socialist movement, much less in Britain. So I'm going to sort of try to also get you to think about some sort of historiographical themes. When this period started to be looked at seriously, which I think is probably the 1950s, There had been a series of, memoirs. Many of the activists wrote their life story, and they often explained, the politics of the time. But when historians, or indeed when many of those activists look back, they tended in some ways to, as is inevitable, to have a great virtue of hindsight. And of course, what started to appear were, I think, a set of stereotypes about the nature of the groups. And if we want to think about that, we only have to think of our own day, in the way that all sorts of left groups are stereotyped, so that a group is often regarded through the prism of its leaders. And so we tend to think of any group as being, in a sense, personified by the leaders. And I'm thinking here of the Social Democratic Federation, which will be, in this period, the main Marxist group, and its leading light, Henry Myers Heinemann, who is a very eccentric character indeed, a sort of Tory stockbroker, who still dressed as a member of the upper middle class with top hat and frock coat when he went out to carry out socialist agitation. And indeed, his stock in trade was to begin a meeting by thanking the working class for keeping him in the style to which he'd become accustomed. And he then proceeded to attack capitalism, from which he was clearly benefiting. Now, Heinemann was a very contradictory and indeed controversial character. He was very pro-imperialist. He was very anti-German. He was anti-Semitic in the language of the time, attacking Jewish bankers and so forth. He was very jingoistic. He was very dictatorial, and so his group is often sort of seen through the prism of this. Now, Heinemann was a dominant figure in this group and remained so for at least 40 years in one way or another. But as a grouping, which probably even in its first 20 to 30 years may have had as many as 100,000 people passing through it, many of whom went on to be quite influential figures in the trade unions, or in other political movements, or indeed in the Labour Party. It's very clear when we read the memoirs of these people that the SDF had, considerable local variations. And so the stereotypes of it, which we just get really from some of the official propaganda that it puts out, I think, hides a lot of differences and often quite a lot of local variation. We're fortunate enough in having complete runs of some newspapers and pamphlets and so forth. And the picture that emerges is of a rather different organization. But perhaps more importantly is, I suppose, something of a boundary setting exercise by historians, which is to argue that the left was always quite marginal, and that, in the famous phrase, the British Labour movement owed more to Methodism than to Marxism. And of course, in the Cold War, and indeed this will still be the case, people argue that Marxists and Marxism are alien to the Labour movement. It's an obscure, incomprehensible foreign ideology. That was certainly the sort of language used by many people even at the time. But the argument was that these were just a handful of extremists and that nobody really followed them. They weren't really very important. They, just simply were on the fringes of politics. And so this sort of boundary setting sort of makes some groups on the left, and indeed in the Labour movement generally, quite acceptable, because they're going to be the ones who win. Because a group like the Independent Labour Party, although it does include many important activists, left-wing activists, also produces many of the people who will become the leaders of the Labour right. And so the accepted version is that these are the dominant people, these are the sensible people. And in particular, there's a type of sort of teleology, a forward march of Labour. And this is particularly true when you read the histories of the Labour Party and of the left that are being written in the 40s and 50s and even into the 60s. The 60s, I think, does, with the growth of the left, and particularly with historians who start looking at what we might think of as history from below, the history workshop movement, the historians group in the Communist Party of Great Britain, all of these people start to rediscover often local activists or important, political movements, which, we've largely dismissed. And of course, there's the issue of what we can learn from them, not, I suppose, in a sort of, Lenin said this in 1912, so therefore it must be true today type of way, but in the way of looking at what the politics were really about, reading, for example, this material and trying to understand the debates. And because we're having many similar debates today, we all find these echoes. In preparing for tonight's talk, I was rereading some of the primary material, and there were a number of passages in both copies of Justice, but also in some of the pamphlets which could have been written today. At one point, William Morris is accusing the SDF of being like a music hall manager who's always got to bring some new novelty before its audience, or else they'll all disappear. And he's attacking the SDF in the 1880s for running a series of agitations in London around unemployment. It's a series of protest marches, some of which of them are quite large, and on occasions they do lead to, some rioting and some violence and so forth. But he said, Morris says, well, if you get one march, what are you going to do after that? And he actually uses the phrase about the Grand Old Duke of York. So the sort of strategies that we debate today about, about the value of protest and about how we're going to build a socialist movement, these people, in many ways, they're our comrades and our forebears. And if you read what they're saying, you can be both inspired but also depressed that they seem to be encountering the same sorts of issues. And of course, it's not just a case, I think, of learning lessons, but trying to understand how those what is then still a relatively new movement, how it's trying to interpret and understand the world in which it's based on. So what I'm going to do is talk about some key events. It follows a loosely chronological structure. It's partly because that's easy, but also it's a way, I think, of bringing some of the themes that I've talked about together in the introduction. The main group on the left for much of our period is the Social Democratic Federation. This is the one that I referred to earlier, the Heinemann grouping. It did change its name to the Social Democratic Party in 1908. Again, if you ever do any searches for Social Democratic Party, you're more likely to throw up David Owen than Heinemann, but the names are in effect interchangeable. What you'll notice straight away is that like all good left-wing groups, the first item on the agenda, to paraphrase the Irish saying, is the split. And it does have a number of splits. One of the splits, for example, which split in 1904, still exists, the Socialist Party of Great Britain. And comrades may well have come across them on occasions. The SDF was an explicitly Marxist organization, but its Marxism, as I've said, was in a sense very conscious of being homegrown, and that was partly because of Heinemann's arguments that continental philosophers wouldn't go down very well in England, as he refers to it, but also I think because Marxism and certainly the main pamphlets and the main books and so on were not widely available. So what we see when we look at its politics are in many ways responses to what people know of as Marxism, but also they draw on some older traditions, as I've said before, Chartism, forms of radicalism, and also some elements from militant trade unionism, particularly in areas of the north of England. So you've got a grouping which is really quite various. It's quite decentralized, with local branches, pursuing all sorts of activity, agitating on unemployment, or carrying out free speech campaigns, trying to secure the right to speak at open air meetings, campaigns on Ireland and repression against the repression of opposition in Ireland, and of course, movements on foreign policy and so forth. The important point about the Social Democratic Federation, I think, was that it had a fairly consistent argument about the need to develop a specifically Marxist political party. And it for that has been criticized often as being sectarian, and indeed of being rather dogmatic. Engels, who of course is still alive for nearly 10 years of this group's existence, is quite critical of them. And although he says that they sort of uphold the dogma, but they do this in a very narrow way. And often he suggests, as other people do, that this results in them turning their back on quite large scale movements that are developing. And this, for example, is where you get a contradiction with this group, that the great strike waves of the late 1880s, the match girls, the dockers and so on, SDF members as individuals are very clearly involved in organizing and helping that. And in the case of somebody like Tom Mann, who is, become an important militant trade unionist, Mann is a member of the SDF, but he's in a sense operating independently outside of the party's discipline. The party, doesn't direct him to work in particular ways. This comes, I think, again to another important point about the politics of the SDF, is that their arguments are essentially that trade unionism, and indeed the struggle for palliatives or immediate reforms, that these struggles are, in the long run, futile, that capitalism will, for example, claw back any of the gains that trade unionists might make. So in terms of improving the conditions of workers on a practical level, trade unions have a limited role. But perhaps more importantly, the argument is that the unions may even be bodies which sort of shore up capitalism. Not only are they led by right-wing bureaucrats, but also that they will tend to sow illusions in reforming the system. So something maybe that comrades today, who I think many comrades come from sort of rather different traditions on this, will be quite surprised at their hostility to the unions. And even in those unions which had organized some of the poorest paid sections of the working class, unions, of course, at this point in the 1880s, do still tend to represent the better off, the more organized sections of the working class, so-called labor aristocracy. And in that way, the rejection of trade unionism as a strategy for the left, can be seen, I think, to have some, you can see where it's coming from. But certainly when the unions start to organize, and indeed some of the left themselves are involved in this, then maybe some of their rejection of trade unionism and their focus on the political is maybe tactically wrong. But in saying that, if you look at the debates which are going on in German social democracy, and more importantly, if you look at the debates in Lenin's pamphlet, What is to be Done, these sorts of ideas are in the socialist movement, and that is particularly the nature of revolutionary consciousness and the type of party that you need to develop that consciousness. And you can see now that people are working out how can you persuade the working class, how can you build a working class movement. And these comrades are doing all the things that are familiar to us. They're out on the street corner selling papers, they're having street meetings, they're organizing petitions, they're organizing big demonstrations. They're really doing the sort of politics which will be very familiar to us. They're even doing it sometimes in the same places. In parts of London, there are speakers' pitches, which I'm sure, well, I know from doing one of those historical walks around London, actually seeing people still selling left-wing papers on the spot where people had been selling them in the 1880s. So their response to these situations would, I think, be very familiar to us. But these are the sort of debates that they're having. And of course, they oscillate between positions. On occasions, they're moving in one position, then in another. And many of the splits and many of the disagreements are recorded in their papers and in their diaries and so forth. So we've got a good idea of what they were talking about. Now, of course, that's one sort of important theme. But the other theme I would want to draw on is their relationship, perhaps, to the wider movement. If the SDF, if its predominant theme is focusing specifically on a Marxist party, then other groupings take a different approach. And a grouping which did receive a lot of support, and indeed in the case of some of the Lancashire branches of the SDF actually participated in this grouping, is the Independent Labour Party. This was formed in 1893, formed in Bradford, and its real basis was in the West Riding of Yorkshire. It arose, or it was given an impetus by a series of strikes in the textile industry, the famous Manningham Mills strike. And it, as a grouping, brings together some existing socialist groups, some members of the SDF, and also some militant trade unionists. And it works on the basis of simply that the working class needs independent representation. It draws from the experience of getting MPs and indeed councillors and so forth elected, but it attempts to bring those groups together. Its program, the ILP's program, focuses on working class representation. It also focuses on the typical demands of the left, on extending democracy, on nationalization of utilities, of wages and conditions and so forth. But what I think is important about the ILP in distinction to the SDF is its so-called ethical socialism. And again, this feeds into this narrative that in Britain, the sort of dogmas of continental Marxism didn't get much of a hearing. And it's very true that the type of nonconformist religion that was quite strong in the West Riding and in parts of the north of England is a very big influencer here. But these people are socialists, but their socialism is often of a very moral character, which emphasizes, I think, a type of conversion. Now, much of the socialist movement in this period argued that people could be converted, as it were, and hear the good news about socialism and become socialists. That that was an argument, and the merger of the socialist movement with the workers' movement was, indeed the main theory or the main theoretical understanding. But the ILP will, I think, be an important force. It will provide many of the leaders of the Labour Party, people like Keir Hardie, Ramsay MacDonald, Philip Snowden. These will all become significant figures. And so again, it represents both a right and a left. In later years, we think of it as being the voice of the left, but in fact, in this period, as a body, it ranges from people who will become, fairly reformist Labour leaders, through to those who will move off to the left. Now, the key turning point, I think, for us is the formation of the LRC. This is the forerunner of the Labour Party. And again, it's this Labour alliance which brings together all Labour movement organisations, and it has a primary aim of securing Labour representation, particularly of securing legislation to remove penalties from the trade unions and to advance social reform in the interests of the working class. It comes into existence from the impetus of the trade unions, but significantly, it also involves delegates from the SDF, the ILP, and the Fabians. And it will be this that's the nucleus of the Labour Party. Now, the LRC goes really in two sort of directions. For much of its time, up until the First World War, it's essentially an adjunct to the Liberal Party. In 1903, the Labour Representation Committee signs a secret agreement with the Liberal Party in which they stand aside in certain constituencies and the Liberals stand aside. And the result is that some Labour MPs are elected in 1906. But this Labour grouping doesn't really, I think, obtain the benefits that many people thought. Certainly, the disabilities are removed on the trade unions, but the Liberals, have their own interests in wishing to do that. And so, the belief that this representational alliance, could be the basis for building a socialist movement, that I think is given pretty short shrift. And indeed, the SDF withdraw from the LRC in 1901. They put forward a set of demands which amount to, I suppose, a type of ideological ultimatum. They put forward a demand that Labour must commit itself to the class war, and when that is defeated, they withdraw, arguing that this body is reformist and so forth. And of course, it does turn out to be that way. But whether the SDF should have withdrawn, whether they should have remained and argued the case, we can consider. But we can certainly see the tactical issues there. But discontent on the left with Labour's performance does lead to the growth of groups outside of the Labour Party, and again, perhaps the most famous of those, although again he's very much an individual, and many people would regard him as fairly volatile and indeed unstable figure. Victor Grayson is elected in the Colne Valley in West Yorkshire in 1907 in a very famous by-election victory, and this shows, I suppose, the basis for a type of socialism that's independent from the Labourism and the representation, and it does give something of a fillip. Although Grayson's a very sort of erratic figure, and indeed loses his seat in 1910 and goes off in very strange directions. Now, if Grayson's election victory sort of reflects one view of the left, and another view is yet again an attempt to go for socialist unity. This is a constant theme, and on several occasions the ILP and the SDF try to merge But the leaders of both, particularly I think the ILP, are very reluctant to do that. The ILP's leadership is very much following the Labour Alliance line and is very reluctant to be seen connected to what they see as this sort of revolutionary continental dogma. And a lot of emphasis is placed upon this. The SDF, again, upholds itself as a Marxist grouping and, is very clear on its politics, although I think these can on occasions be quite narrow, but we might want to debate that. I think that they've been often traduced. But they do form a group, the British Socialist Party, in 1911, which actually affiliates to the Labour Party in 1916. This grouping is in a sense the SDF with a few smaller left groupings. So although it's supposedly a socialist unity project, it's really a really the SDF with just a few adherents. Now, when I mention the affiliation to the Labour Party, I want to perhaps talk about quite an important point which will come up in 1918, and indeed I'm sure that Lawrence next week, when he looks at the Communist Party, will draw on this, and that is the nature of the Labour Party, which I'm really now just going to conclude. I'm afraid I've rather overrun the time, so I will draw this to a close. Labour didn't exist as a party in any sense that we understand it. I can't think of a grouping that's quite like it, but maybe the LLA in its earlier period, maybe the LRC, the modern LRC, has some elements of this. And this is that the Labour Party of this pre-1918 period was essentially a federation of different groupings. So the only way you could be, quote, a member of the Labour Party was to be a member of an affiliated organization. And that could be a socialist grouping like the ILP or the British Socialist Party, but it could also be a trade union, or it could be another body. So you could not really be a member of the Labour Party as such, but you could be a member of the local Labour Representation Committee. So if you imagine that in every locality there's a committee of different socialist groups, and they meet together and they might select a candidate or they might develop political agitation, that's what the Labour Party was like. Now, in 1918, that situation was quite radically altered. And it was also the period when the ideological framework of Clause 4 was brought in. Clause 4 was drafted by the Fabian couple, Sidney and Beatrice Webb. And although the left, particularly in the 50s, has upheld it as a symbol of socialism, if you read it very carefully, and indeed you look at the debates around it, you'll see that in a way it's a form of state socialism, and that in particular it emerges from the experience of the First World War, which is of almost forms of state capitalism, state regulation of the economy. In the German phrase, Kriegssozialismus, a sort of war socialism. And the experience of that feeds directly, I think, into the formulation of Clause 4. And again, we can perhaps debate that in the questions and so on, about that. Now, its importance was that it establishes Labour as having a clearly sort of different position from the Liberals, but it's still very much, I think, one in which it's a managed form of capitalism. I'm talking about what the Webbs were advocating in that period, 1917 to 1918. It also reflects much of the experience of the Russian Revolution. And again, we can't really underestimate the importance of the First World War and the Russian Revolution on influencing the ideas of socialists in this period, both, positively in terms of the understanding of revolutions and of Soviets and the nature of the state, but also negatively that reformist socialists and indeed the capitalist class in general realized that they would need to arm themselves and indeed inoculate the movement against those sorts of extreme communistic ideas. But the other important thing that the 1918 conference does, again, I think as part of political repositioning, and again, it's suggested by the Webbs, but also by Herbert Morrison, who'd been a cabinet member and leading trade unionist and leader of the Labour Party, is of course, Arthur Henderson, not Herbert Morrison, Arthur Henderson, is the idea of individual membership. And that, there is, I think, nothing wrong with that per se, but this is very much part of a strategy to remove the federal nature and now to start setting the boundaries that I talked about earlier. In other words, that the definition of labor and laborism will now be more tightly drawn. There will be a number of years in 1918, even as late as 1924, which I'm sure Lawrence will talk about, in which those boundaries between communists and the left and, quote, the Labour Party will be blurred. And that's because under the old system of Labour representation, you could select anybody from any tendency you wish to be your candidate. So alongside clause 4, part 4 of ideological definition, there's now also an organizational definition. And it will be this that will be the basis, I think, of the witch hunts and the attacks on the left that will emerge in the 20s and in the 1930s. But comrades, I've spoken for a little longer than I wished, so I will pull back now and just allow comrades to come in. My apologies for overrunning.
Thank you very much, comrade. I'm having a bit of trouble. I'm trying to put the biography on the internet, but it seems to be not working. Anyway, we'll be emailing it out and trying to repair the internet link. Well, thank you very much for this introduction. Fascinating, isn't it? You hear about those struggles to, for left unity outside the Labour Party, inside the Labour Party. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? When selling papers on the same spot that we're still selling our papers today, is quite fascinating. So comrades, if you want to make a contribution, if you want to get involved in the discussion, please could you raise your hand? You can ask questions or make contributions, whatever you wish. Okay, I've got a couple of people who I'm trying to make into panelists. John and Anthony. Seems to be I think, not so easy today. Something's not quite working. John, you had your hand up first. I cannot make you into a panelist for some reason. That glitch sometimes happens. Would you like to speak with? I can allow you to talk from the audience. You should be able to be heard now. If you want to make a contribution like that, is that okay? John, you have to unmute yourself. It's not working yet. Okay, Anthony then first. If you could unmute yourself.
I think the whole importance of democracy is very, very important because capitalism cannot rule in this country and the trade union and Labour Party bureaucracy cannot rule in the same way. It's very, very important. I mean, I just need to a piece of legislation this afternoon on the Politics Live on the online hate bill and how they're going to move in all kinds of democratic rights and Stalin was going along with it, and the left club were fighting fascism. And even Paul Mason said that some extreme right-wing elements of the Tory party that linked up with right-wing populists and fascists, and he was voting on that, wanting to support that legislation. I mean, they're not moving on the missile movement. They're not moving on the against the fascists.
Could you speak a little slower, please? Sorry.
How fast have I been?
Very.
Yeah, I'll start again.
Yeah.
Just tell me if I'm too fast. I think the fight for democracy is very, very important in the next period, because you want your democratic rights. There are big battles to get the Labour Party and the unions to win these concessions to get unions organised in the Labour Party. But the capitalist class are split. Some want to make concessions, others want to take away democratic rights. But that new bill is very important, called the online hate bill. Is going to be an attack on democratic rights. Those who want radical change could have their sights banned or anything. And Starmer's going to back it on the basis of fighting the fascists and the homophobes. And Paul Mason says some of these extreme right-wingers are tied up with fascist elements because of the anti-fascist character, so-called. He's going to vote for us on Politics Live this afternoon. And it's very, very dangerous legislation. They're not targeting the misogynists, they're not targeting the fascists, saying that the left. I think the other thing is do we know much about the crisis in unison? Because there could be legal battles, all kinds of battles going on. Because the NEC are saying if the right wing don't carry out the decisions of the membership with the NEC, they can be disciplined. So the unions are breaking up. You've had Sharon Graham get elected on this for doing more for the members. But the reason that the Labour Party was more democratic than the other groups was millions of workers were involved, very bureaucratic in terms of the subordination to imperials and the reformism. But they had to have democratic debates in the 80s. They wanted to move away from that type of politics, where the left was more fought more and more of an orientation wouldn't have got away with so much. They're at war, finished him off. But now, last point, I think that the reason the new Labour don't want the trade union branch, a lot of the left trade union bureaucrats having a say on the party. They're reflecting the cutbacks and the attack on democracy of the capitalists, and they represent a lot of new Labour reflect those pressures. And a lot of the trade union movement want a different direction, and the mass of the Labour Party so it's heading for an historic schism, and they're getting no flexibility democratically. So even in the Labour Party, there's going to be recomposition in the Labour Party, and even some of the unions are recomposing. The Labour might not be in its current form much longer in the unions or the Labour Party, but I think democracy is a very important thing. And it's important. I think one thing you could talk about, Kevin, is what the SDF, the Socialist Party, before the Russian Revolution. Were there any differences, like internal bulletins, like after the Bolshevik sense, and internal debates and differences, or did people care that understood their own thing? That'd be interesting to know about, because a similar culture, sectarianism and opportunism and lack of democracy still prevails. At the time, there are disputes with the internal bulletins every so often when there's differences. But it's not systematic as it should be. The American Socialist Works Party was full of disputes and documents, and the Bolshevik. But I'll leave it there. And we're slower now. We're slowed down.
Yeah, you're fine.
Slow down a bit. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
I've actually got no other hands up now. John didn't actually want to speak. He made a mistake. Kevin, do you want to come back on?
Yeah, sure. Anthony did ask some questions in the text as well. Yeah. One of the things, Anthony, just on your last point about discussion, is that if you look in the newspapers and also in some of the pamphlets, you will see a degree of discussion, at conferences and so forth. And these are then these are published, and I think that sort of democracy and that sort of element is very important. I think also, though, you do get the other aspects of any sort of party or organization, and Heinemann in particular was identified with a fairly bureaucratic approach, often taking decisions without reference to members. But you also have, I think, a fairly healthy democratic attitude by many of his members. And on occasions, the leadership are defeated, they're replaced, and these things are debated. So I think there is actually an interesting culture. I think the only real way we can discover this is often to look at the at the sources. I took this up initially about 40 years ago, not as a hobby as such, but as an interest. I began to look in local newspapers, and I found their reports of meetings. I mean, even during elections, they sent reporters out to the street meetings organized by the left. And we've no way of telling whether they were verbatim, but they're fairly detailed and I think fairly accurate. So a meeting that's organized by a left group is reported by a reporter who goes out and notes it down. So we've got the flavor of what's going on, and of course we still have some surviving minute books. We've got records of branch activities and so forth. And in a few cases, there are a few organizations, and although they're they're not as active as they once were, but I mean they are directly linked. In a number of towns, not just in the north of England, there are groups called socialist clubs, which were sprang out of the Social Democratic Federation, and you can still look at their minute books and you can get a sense of what's going on. I think that the trade unions are much more bureaucratic, and I think again, Anthony makes a point there about the nature of the unions, and we understand the nature of unions, their relationship in capitalism, but remember that many of the trade union leaders in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were intimately connected to the Liberal Party. Unions like the miners had very close relationships with the Liberals up until about 1908. So their bureaucratic control over their members was a very important theme, and I think we clearly see that. Just one last point. I mean, I won't comment too much on the contemporary politics, but what I think is important about the battle for democracy, and it's something I have to keep on reminding people, is that in the period we're talking about, a large number of people, obviously large numbers of women, although women do have a vote in some limited local and other circumstances, but large numbers of people don't have the right to vote. And so the battle for democracy, the battle for universal suffrage, or particularly the battles between those who want manhood suffrage or those who say, no, it must be for everybody, are very important. I think I've mentioned this point before, but I will mention it again, that one of the things that sort of brought me up with the start was when I looked at my grandfather's trade union card when he joined a union, I think around about 1916, 1917. On the card, the demand is for manhood suffrage, the right to vote. So the right to vote, people are campaigning for that right. And then the question is, well, if we've got the right to vote, what are we going to do with it? Are we just going to put one version of the employing class in power, or do we put our own class in power? And if we do send people to Parliament, how are they going to behave? If we do get control of a local council, what do we do with it? So the struggle for democracy, and also the struggle for free speech as well, socialists carried out open air meetings because that was the only way they could, get their views across. And they were often attacked, not just by the police, but for example, by crowds of, thugs organized by the Tories in particular. But the socialists stood their ground and fought back and said, right, well, we have the right to speak. And, this is the way that we're going to try and get our message across. So these battles for the right to speak and the right to organize, that they weren't handed down to us. And we often forget that, the development of democracy in Britain can be portrayed as a sort of almost gradual, natural process. Tell that to the people who were fighting in the East End of London on an area called Mile End Waste, not far from Whitechapel Tube. They wanted to hold public meetings because that was the only place they could do it. in that way. A couple of comrades have asked me questions about film footage or photographs. Well, there are plenty of photographs. You know, this is the great age of photography, and all of the big demonstrations and all of the socialist leaders, you can get photographs. There are quite a few available. The film footage is a little less easy to get hold of. It becomes increasingly more important from 1914, but there are film footage of some great strike meetings. The 1911 transport strike in Liverpool has got, you know, plenty of film coverage, and of course, as we go on and we start to get sound, we'll also have speeches and so on as well. I think if anybody's interested, I think that there's a museum in Manchester. Well, there are two museums in Manchester that are well worth trying to get along to, and they have archives. One is the National Labour History Museum, which has some permanent exhibitions of you know, memorabilia. Some of it's better than others. I'm not sure that Harold Wilson's Gannex raincoat is really up there with you know, some of the early trade union banners, but it also has records of meetings and newspaper runs and so on. The other museum that's also in Manchester is started out as a house that was owned by a couple called Eddie and Ruth Frau, who were members of the Communist Party, and they started to collect and keep all their books. And in the end, they decided, and when they died, it was turned essentially into a library. So when they were alive, it was a library where they sort of lived in the corner of the house, and that's again has got material. And I know Lawrence, who's done a lot more primary research on the later period than I have, as you know, tells me, and I've seen them, but the British Library in London, which you don't have to visit physically, but you can get a subscription and you can read online copies of many of these newspapers. I mean, they're quite difficult to read because they've got a lot of print and so forth, but you can read a lot of this material. And in lots of parts of the country, there are local record offices which will have minute books and other items. So there is actually a treasure trove out there. And over the years, working class activists, you know, have investigated it. They've gone and looked at what's going on in their own area in that way. I'm trying to look at some of the questions in the there. I have a problem.
Someone is asking, Alan was asking if, I'm not sure if you answered that, but was the party more democratic then than it is now? And did they, for example, implement conference decisions, or was it similar to today? Just ignore it. No, we know the Palestine motion will never be implemented, ever.
Well, in some ways it was more democratic, and in other ways it wasn't. I suppose because Labour did not have, it was still a small force, it became the official opposition in 1918 by, not quite a fluke, but by a split in the Liberal Party. It meant that policy formation, particularly of the sort we have today, which is linked to government, was not such a big issue. But it did mean that motions were often quite, you know, bitterly contested. But the parliamentary party did operate pretty well autonomously. And indeed, there was no leader of the party, but there was a chair of the parliamentary party. and that chair was quite an important figure. The other issue about policy formation was, of course, that the party was a federation. So if, for example, a resolution was passed that the ILP didn't like, then they weren't really bound by it. And I suppose, you know, a point I should have really pushed was that unlike the continental parties, which developed as explicitly socialist groupings, Labour was very much a federation of both some explicitly socialists and trade unionists. And so the emphasis on having political clarity over and above Labour representation wasn't as great until I think 1918, when the need to define Labour as clearly a social democratic, and I mean that in the sort of contemporary sense, you know, reformist party rather than a revolutionary party, meant drawing those boundaries became more important. So, in comparison, say, with the German Social Democrats, who would have a fairly developed sort of theoretical life, and where the party conference would be important, I think that was much less developed. But inside some of the groupings that I've described, you would have that, and that then accounts for the democracy. A group like the British Socialist Party was affiliated to the Labour Party, and it would, between 1918 and 1920, be a very important component part of what was to become the Communist Party. So you can see that that really all sorts of tendencies could be affiliated to the Labour Party. And indeed, in the discussions that occur when the Communist Party is established about whether it should affiliate and what the attitude should be, it was on the basis that you could go to the conference and you could put forward ideas in that way. A question that I see on there is, which is actually an interesting one, is about the infiltration from the right, particularly from sort of business groupings. And one of the things that's quite interesting right at the beginning is that the established political parties did attempt to use socialist groups, often in election campaigns. There are a number of cases of the SDF being approached by mysterious figures who offer them lots of money to stand candidates. One, a certain Maltman Barry, who's a former, claims to have been a Marxist, was working for the Tories and persuaded the SDF to stand a few candidates in London, where they did fairly badly. And actually it came out that they'd received what was referred to as Tory gold. And it did have a bit of an impact on discrediting them in that way. The other question, perhaps more related, though, that I think it's Faraz who asked the question, is that the employers clearly identified people. So if you were an active socialist who, for example, spent your Saturdays speaking in the local marketplace, then that wouldn't go unnoticed, and many people lost their jobs. You know, it was a bit of a risk, you know, which people took. So infiltration in that sense, you know, many of the leaders, particularly many of the trade union leaders, were already very close to the employers. And indeed, one of the earliest Labour MPs, David Shackleton, MP for Clitheroe, he left the Labour Party, I think, in about 1911 to become a senior civil servant. And that sort of crossover into the establishment, which many trade union leaders have done before and since, you know, was not uncommon. The other question that's asked there is about America. And America is very important for us. And actually what's going on in the world in general is important. One of the things that as part of a world empire was that British people and British socialists were very conscious of international affairs. They're very conscious of what was going on elsewhere. And, they followed it very closely. And indeed, American socialists, particularly Daniel de Leon and the Wobblies, were actually quite influential in Britain. The Socialist Labour Party that split from the SDF in 1904 was a group that from Scotland primarily, there were some from London, who were quite influenced by Daniel de Leon's and ideas. And in fact, the contacts had been established by somebody being sent from Scotland to America to sort of carry out some research about what these people were up to, and coming back with pamphlets in his suitcase and then sort of distributing them. And in time, the American de Leonists sent their newspapers to Scotland, and people were actually selling American newspapers in Scotland. So what was happening in America, people watched it because, of course, America was a growing, developing capitalist economy. The concentrations of wealth into the trusts. People thought, well, this is the future. And of course, the labor movement was militant. It was often confronted with violence by the state and by the employers. So, people did follow it, and it was, I think, influential. And, as was the case with the political struggles going on in the French socialist movement, or people were discussing what Kautsky was debating with Luxembourg in Germany and so on. So, this sense of being part of a wider movement, is clearly there, and I think that's more generally true. We mustn't think that because communications weren't as rapid, that people were not only not interested, but they weren't able to get information. It might have taken time, but people did I think link up with the world in that way.
Okay, I have Steve Freeman who actually wants to ask a question or make a contribution. Hello, Steve.
Hi, Tina. Yes, I would like to make a contribution, and I think, Kevin, there's a problem, which is that although you've given an interesting, and actually, in my view, a sort of standard history of what's gone on, I don't think that standard history entirely works. I mean, the thing that's missing from the story, is there's no discussion or mention of republicanism. Mm-hmm. Now, it's completely absent, although you talked about the struggle for democracy. So there is obviously democratic struggles going on, and that's right. But if we go back, therefore, to 1918, so I'll start at the end and then go back to the beginning. If we start at when the modern Labour Party was formed, it was formed not just in 1918, but I would say its character was formed between 1918 and 1923. In 1918, Clause 4, as you say, was passed. That gave the Labour Party its socialist character. And in 1923, the Labour Party passed a resolution by 4 million votes to 300,000 to support the monarchy. Mm. So the character of the Labour Party in this period was a monarchist socialist party. I don't know, would it be a socialist monarchist party, but it's not changed that character ever since that period. Now, we can't understand that if we don't know what's going on outside Britain. So what's going on between 1916 and 1923? All of a sudden, there's well, as you know only too well, 1916, the Easter Uprising, the Irish Republic is declared. 1917, the Republic comes to Russia, the First Republic. Then the Second Republic comes in October 1917. And then you've got the German Revolution in 1918. So, and then you've got Hungary. So you've got the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburgs, there's monarchies are crashing all over the place. At the same time, George IV at that time, they changed their name to Windsors because they don't want to be seen to be German. And then the next thing that they do is that they won't let the Tsar come because they're absolutely terrified that a republic would come here at that time. So in a way, you could see that Clause 4, which is very radical, it's probably Stalinism before Stalin almost, you know, it's very radical, but actually it's put there as an alternative to the danger of republicanism, because it's to say we nationalize, just think of socialism, nationalization of everything. That's very, very radical. We won't ever carry it out, of course, obviously not. but it sounds exceptionally radical as an answer to the republicanism and democracy that sprung up in Europe as a result of the imperialist war. So in a way, Clause 4 is an alternative to republicanism. But then in 1923, when the counter-revolution has come right through, you know, 1921 Kronstadt, when the Civil War's won, then it's lost, then Stalin's on the rise and all those other things. 1923, there's the period of the counter-revolution. So Clause 4 in the Labour Party then becomes, we vote by 4 million votes to 300 to keep the monarchy. So that character has both, both a response to the Russian Revolution and a sign of the defeat of the working class in the Russian Revolution, of the Republican democracy of the working class. So I think that's what we've got to, what's missing from the story then is to understand this other character of the British. So if we wind the clock back to the beginning of the story rather than the end bit of the story, if we go back to 1870, then in 1870 there is a mass Republican movement. As I mean, you'll know these things, Kevin, so I'm not saying that you don't know, but I mean, just for the sake of the argument, there is a mass Republican movement. And that Republican movement, which dies with the Paris Commune, but it goes into the Democratic Federation. The Democratic Federation is Republican. But when it goes over to the SDF, its Republicanism starts to disappear. And in fact, Heinemann, the Tory Marxist Heinemann, is actually a royalist. And in fact, the SDF wants to give a donation to Queen Victoria's Jubilee. So we've got a kind of royalist Marxist there in you know, a Tory Marxist, if you like. So I mean, except that the rank and file of the isn't like that. And of course, you see James Connolly in the Socialist Labour Party, which, by the way, the alternative name for the Socialist Labour Party was going to be the alternative proposed by, I think it was Tom Mann, I'm not sure, was to be called the Republican Socialist Party. So there was an element there somehow in that thinking. And then, of course, you've got Keir Hardie, and in the ILP you've got republicanism, and then you've got MacDonald, who's an absolute ardent royalist. So the Labour Party is a kind of broad church of loyalists and Republicans. You know, that's the political character, and the loyalist is the bourgeoisie. If you want to say the classic formula, the bourgeois workers' party, well, the loyalists are the bourgeois part of the Labour Party, and the Republican bit, if you trace it back to Marx and Lenin and all those other things, that's the Republican Democratic part of it as well. So that's gone into the mix of the Labour Party. There's always been an element of republicanism in there, and you can carry on that story right the way through. But what I'm simply saying is that we need to put part of the republicanism into this story of the Labour Party if we really understand its character. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Steve. Matthew Jones wants to come in before I bring in Kevin, I guess. Or do you want to reply to Steve first before we hear from Matthew?
No, I'll do it as a sum up. My voice is going a bit.
Okay, all right. Matthew, if you could switch on your camera. Oh, oops, I muted you, sorry.
I muted myself, yeah. Sorry, comments, I had to go another call a minute ago. Some of the things I'm going to say may have been said by somebody else. I mean, I think, I mean, one of the thing about the Labour Party and of course the evolution of the left in Britain is, of course, its relation to the rest of Europe. I mean, you know, there are, of course, the whole business takes place at the point of which, you know, you do have the mass Second International, in which some people in Britain actually take part in. I think mainly the SDF, but I suspect some other parts as well. You know, are present in the congresses in which there is this, you know, huge debates and so on around, you know, numbers of a series of questions, particularly obviously the First World War. More famously, you know, obviously the question of the First World War, and of course the Second International is alone in predicting, you know, publicly saying the First World War is going to happen, and it will oppose it. You know, unfortunately, of course, fails to carry this out, despite the fact, of course, it passes Rosa Luxemburg's famous resolution. The First World War, of course, splits the Labour Party down the middle. Largely in the basis of a wing which supports the war, including, as Kevin says, Heinemann, and you know, the parliament, a good part of the Parliamentary Labour Party, and another part which is largely pacifist, you know, including Keir Hardie. Of course, Keir Hardie himself dies in 1915, having opposed the war, which is obviously to his credit. But not on the basis not on the basis that say Lenin or Trotsky or whoever were opposing the war, as Kevin said, a tremendous confusion in terms of the fact that the whole Second International, more or less, apart from one railway carriage worth of people in Kirtal, were collapsed into supporting the war. Although, of course, as you go through the war, of course, there's this tremendous movement in the working class. Really notable here, actually, of course, in Glasgow, Vax movement, the Glaswegian region and the West of Scotland in general, against the conditions that were forced on workers in one way or another, the housing conditions, a whole lot, which is more or less in a state of revolt by the time we get to the end of the First War. And there is a genuine worry that there will be a revolt, and on the basis of obviously of some kind of a Soviet uprising in Glasgow. I don't think politically it never really got to that point, unfortunately. But it did get to the point where they were sending they locked up the local regiments in the barracks because they didn't think they were reliable, and they shipped in troops from England in an effort to control to have control, and including, of course, the famous incident where they brought in a series of tanks, which were famously pictured in the old meat abattoir, the cattle market in Glasgow and elsewhere. So I mean, in those terms, tremendous upsurge in terms of, and that happens, obviously in some other parts, not to the degrees here, but a huge upsurge in the working class, before the First World War, and then particularly through the First World War. And so that background, is the formation, as you say, of both of the Labour Party as a membership organisation, and the Communist Party comes out of that in different strands. And I'm presuming we'll go through and discuss in a greater degree. There's a sort of the strands that go into both organisations in the 20s. And you get, obviously the election of the numbers of very left-wing MPs in Glasgow, because the working class. The thing is, the interesting historicity, of course, is that when at the end of the First World War, the ruling class, in fear of its own, of its power and so on, has to concede. Has to concede on wages, has to concede on the votes, and so the working class then votes in huge numbers, and actually the turnout in the 20s in this city was over 80%, and it elects these very left-wing MPs, including a number of members, ILP members and DSP members, etc. And contrast to now, in which the working class understands that voting makes very little difference to them, and less than 50% of the working class now votes in Glasgow, and you can see that evolution over a period of time. Of the decay of parliamentary democracy. But I think it's one of those. It's a hugely significant moment, in terms of, as you say, the formation of an actual party, as opposed to basically the groupings of federation and so on and so forth, and the consolidation of a party, which is clearly, of course, dominated by its right wing right from the start. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Christine wants to come in as well. Sorry, Christine, could you switch on your camera? There she is.
I don't know if I'm being seen and heard.
Yes, we can hear you now. Hello.
Okay, hello. I haven't got much to say. I just want to say that as a disabled woman, I'm feeling a bit left out of this discussion. I know that disability was probably quite a big issue in the Russian Revolution because of all the people, all the soldiers who were injured and badly maimed, etc. And I know it was kind of brushed under the carpet a bit afterwards, probably, but I'm not being an historian of that period, I don't know. So I'd really like to hear more of the perspective of women in this and of disabled people, because they're just kind of, they haven't been mentioned hardly, have they? That's all I've got to say. I'm just representing my demographic. I'm old as well.
Thank you, Christine. Okay, Kevin, lots to come back to. You've got the room.
Okay, thanks, comrades, for the comments and questions. Partly in defence, I kept to a very tight brief and even so managed to go over. I deliberately just went up to 1918 and the later developments I deliberately left. And likewise, there were a whole number of things about working class struggle and so on I could have brought in, but I wanted to just focus on some of these organizations. But I mean, I think all the points that everybody has made have been quite, quite important. I didn't talk about, for example, the development of particular movements. The same can be said of the trade unions, because I wanted to focus on the organizations of the left. The organization of women as a distinct grouping is, I think, going to be important. It was more developed in Germany and in continental Europe, but there were clearly the suffrage movement was very important. And again, I was focusing on a particularly narrow view of the left, and I didn't. I mean, I could have done work on the women's question, but I think we were talking really about those sorts of politics. On the question of disability, there was agitation around it, Christine, for the same reasons that there would have been in Russia, and that was, of course, people who were injured in the war. And again, this is slightly outside of my time, but there clearly were people organizing ex-service people. Indeed, there were various organizations established to agitate for improvements and for pensions, but also medical treatment, and of course for those people who've been very badly injured, limbs and medical treatment. And indeed, some of the although again it goes beyond my particular period, or the one that I set myself here, but in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, these groups were sufficient of a concern for the state to establish counter groups. So groups like the British Legion were actually set up to, in a sense, counter the unpatriotic reminder of many disabled service people about what had happened. In the wider sense, though, I mean, disability of the sort that we would recognize today was treated, in various ways, probably most of them not particularly positive, but local authorities where particular socialists and Labour people could get control of them often did start to carry out policies, to make improvements for people with disabilities. But I don't think, we need to be told that even in comparison with the woeful conditions today, there was really a very long way to go in that. But on the women's question, I think that is does really deserve another discussion. And we're focusing perhaps narrowly, and perhaps comrades can criticize that. But I wanted to talk about the nature of the left, in which which a number of women comrades were very important. If comrades go and look at Martin Crick's book, which unfortunately now is at the bottom of the pile, so I can't easily get it out. But he has quite a few biogs of leading people, and again, a number of women comrades there. My own research is in East Lancashire, followed on from the work of people like Jill Lidington, who did work on the suffrage movement. And also, although again, this is all much later than the period I'm talking about, the development of campaigns for various medical, antenatal, communal laundries, and other issues that were being raised by female socialists in that period. There's quite an interesting account called Red Little Moscows, which looks at the type of radical policies that are being developed. But that may be, not maybe, it should be the subject of another discussion. On the left more broadly, I think one point I would make, which I perhaps didn't sufficiently put forward, was I suppose this relationship between the left and the right, and in particular, the way that the party was, for many on the left, and particularly many people in the ILP who had sort of personal and organizational links with some of the people who would become prominent on the right. The focus on, I suppose, loyalty to the party, and the focus on the need to have a united party, hence the idea of the Labour Alliance, was really a very strong theme. So that idea of the Labour Alliance bringing in people who were, fairly pro-capitalist, trade union leaders who did not have a particularly idea of transforming society. That focus on unity often meant that the left would quite voluntarily chain themselves to the right. And I think this is particularly the case, again, it's really beyond the period, but we can certainly see it with people like MacDonald, Ramsay MacDonald, who is opposed to the war, like Philip Snowden, but who will, in the Labour governments of the 1920s, behave impeccably in a pro-capitalist way, and yet will still retain the image of left-wingers because of their wartime record, but perhaps more importantly, the organizational loyalty that many people had towards them. And I think that focus on unity at all costs, is there very clearly on the left, and it's embodied in the ILP. The SDF, I think, are much less likely to be that way. On the republicanism question, well, Steve, I am aware of Bradlaugh, and I'm particularly aware that the Democratic Federation, is born from people who are involved in that Republican movement. Although, as I think many of the histories make the point, the sort of wave of that passes, certainly by the late 80s. I didn't know about the SDF's fundraising for the Jubilee, but given what I know about Heinemann, I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't present a loyal address to the Queen. That his sort of Tory Marxism is in that sense quite strange. I think your point about republicanism and about the sort of constitutional loyalism is important. And I think it's particularly important in terms of, the Labour Representation Committee and indeed the Labour Party in Parliament that develops. And the point you make about challenging that, and in particular challenging the empires and so on. Again, I think that's more, I suppose, about Labour, and I was steering it onto the organisations of the Labour left. But I think, again, you're quite right that many of the constitutional issues, particularly on the nature of the monarchy and on the need for the republic, that was played down. It was much stronger, obviously, in Ireland, and obviously the influence of continental socialism But I think that also tells us something about the nature of the Labour Party, and indeed even many of the people who we designate as being on the left, that their leftism did clearly have these limits. You know, there were other areas where this type of loyalism came in. The idea of you know, getting rid of the House of Lords altogether, and also in 1900 the abolition of the standing army and its replacement with the People's Militia. Again, you know, that's one manifesto commitment which I wouldn't mind seeing being carried out. But you can see, I suppose, that the drift in that way tells us quite a lot about the nature of British Labourism. And then lastly, just on Matthew, yeah, I think we can explain the growth of these movements, these left currents, by clearly what's happening outside. I mean, I left off the so-called syndicalist movement before 1914, the movements in the First World War. These are going to put life on these groupings. They're going to involve, you know, thousands of people, and they're then going to be quite important in shaping the politics that are going to come after. But that will be coming after when Lawrence looks at it. One thing, if comrades want to, I think it was Matthew made the point, if you want to get a sort of sense of the discussion, particularly the way that parties like the British Socialist Party and the ILP and the Fabians as well were involved in the Second International, Lawrence has a blog, and if you look at the blog, he's got some reports of the links between the BSP, the ILP, and the Second International, particularly the unification discussions which are taking place in 1911, 1912. And you'll find there something about the involvement of those groupings. Anyway, thank you for the comments and questions. And, you know, I'm certainly looking forward to the rest of the series. And I'm certainly looking forward to Lawrence next week, who will be able to, I'm sure, take the story on and, you know, see the development of this left. What I was, I suppose, trying to stress was that this left was still in many ways quite inchoate, but I think the Russian Revolution, for and against, then becomes the dividing line. Up until then, the war, I suppose, is another dividing line, but up until then, as we might see with MacDonald, it was quite possible to think of MacDonald as a sort of comrade who was maybe just a little bit moderate than you were. But of course, when he comes into power, and indeed later when he joins or forms the national government, we'll see where that moderation really lies. So the position on the First World War is the beginnings, I think, of that differentiation. But of course, the pacifist nature of it hides a lot, but it's the Russian Revolution, I think, will be the real marker, and how you respond to that. But that's for later sessions. So thanks, comrades.
We're looking forward to it. Thank you very much, Kevin. That was a great introduction, first session of this new series. Tell your friends, tell your comrades. Next week, we've got our guest speaker, Lawrence Parker, who, as Kevin said, will look at how the Communist Party and its relationship with the Labour Party, and then the witch hunt of communists from the Labour Party. Okay, comrades, have a good evening. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Kevin.